Welcome to our first video in our distant learning part of our class. We are starting part 4 on the Synoptic traditions. This is the first of 5 sessions. Now you may wonder what it means, Synoptic traditions. I have a book here that's called the Synopsis of 4 Gospels. So you can see it has something to do with the Gospels. We're moving on to the Gospels. And this particular book is an interesting book. This is the English edition, where you can see all 4 Gospels together. For example, here you have the passage of the healing of the paralytic. So you have this from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Actually doesn't have much written here in the first part, but then later John comes in and it compares what kind of stories are where in the Gospels. There are, for example, passages where you have stories only in Matthew and in Luke, but not in Mark and not in John. Or when you come back later to the stories of the Passion, you certainly see that all 4 Gospels have parts of the story written down. In this kind of book, you can easily compare and see where the different stories are. But the Synoptic Gospels are really excluding the Gospel of John. It really has only the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The word synopsis comes from the Greek, and it means to see together or seeing together. Syn, you probably remember that word from synergy or synchrony or something. It always means together. And opsis or optic, you probably can see, like the glasses, I have to go to the optician and so on. So that means seeing together, synoptic or synopsis, seeing together, like here. You see all the Gospels together next to each other and you can compare them. There's another Greek word that we need to learn here. That word is called kerygma. Kerygma means message. So we may ask, for example, what is the kerygma of the Gospel of Mark? Or what's the kerygma of the Gospel of Matthew? So we want to find that out. You notice that when we open the Bible, it starts with the Gospel of Matthew, followed by Mark, then Luke, and then John. And we just said that John is kind of in its own league, so we will not talk about John right now. That will come later when we talk about the Johannine traditions. We'll really only deal with the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And by extension, also about the book of Acts. Now, the reason why Matthew is first in the Bible is because for a long time, in the tradition of the church, people thought that Matthew is the oldest Gospel. That goes back to an old tradition also of St. Augustine in the early medieval times, who proposed that Matthew is the oldest Gospel and that Mark and Luke copied from Matthew, and that Matthew was the oldest and Mark comes the next, and then comes Luke, and then John is the youngest Gospel. If you notice, Mark, it is the shortest, it only has 16 chapters, and it's usually dated between the years 60 and 70 in a common era or AD. I like to date it around 65 CE. Matthew is supposed to be between 70 and 80 CE. I like to date it between around 72 CE, and it has 28 chapters. It's the longest of the Gospels. And Luke has 24 chapters and was written around 75 to 85 CE. I like to date it more like at 75 CE. Now, why were Gospels written? We just finished the Pauline tradition and we heard, of all these letters that St. Paul wrote between the years of 50 to 60 CE. And that was the first way in which people communicated, those early congregations that had formed and had tried to figure out what it actually means to be Christian. And they had those letters, to go back and forth between the congregations and Paul and those early builders. Now, what changed that suddenly about 10 years later, you have the form of a gospel? The Pauline tradition was an era when the congregations were being built, when there were new converts coming to Christianity, and when there were still many eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus alive. When the Gospels were first written, the first generation started to disappear. Many stories about Jesus existed orally already. People had told stories about how Jesus had healed someone and what he was preaching and what miracles he did. At the end of the Pauline tradition, Nero became the emperor in Rome, and there is a good chance that Paul actually was decapitated by the Emperor Nero, who was a horrendous tyrant against the early Christian community. Life in Jerusalem and in Israel became very, very tense. The Romans were more and more difficult to live with for the Jewish people, and so they were looking to see if there wouldn't be a new Messiah. Remember the term Messiah? The anointed one? The one that would liberate Israel again, to make it a kingdom. And so many people were looking for this new Messiah that would come to overthrow the Romans. There was more and more unrest that actually led at some point to the first Jewish war that lasted from 66 to 70 CE. So right in that time before the war started, around 65, that's when Mark started to write down his gospel and contributed towards the idea of who the Messiah really is. He was proposing that this guy that was crucified by the Romans, that he was actually the Messiah. And so he collected all the stories about the life of Jesus to bring about that message that the real Messiah that everybody was looking for was Jesus. Then the war started, right after the writing of Mark's gospel. And the war was terrible. It lasted to the end of Nero's life, who died in 68 CE. It continued there was even in Roman Empire, there was like a uprising there, because there was a year between the years 68 and 69 when there were three emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Each one of them was assassinated, and finally then Vespasian came to reign in the year 69. And Vespasian really had enough of all these uprisings in Jerusalem. He brought in his army and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem. It was a total destruction. Many Jewish people at that time were enslaved and put to work to build lots of Roman buildings. A portion of the Jewish people escaped to several different fortresses. One big one is the fortress of Masada, and it took another 3 years until the year 73, when the Romans were finally able to storm that fortress of Masada, and only to find that all the people that had escaped there had committed suicide because they did not want to serve in slavery for the Romans. So you can see it was a big upheaval, a big frightening time for Jewish people, and certainly in the mix of that also for the Christians, because they were by the Romans kind of seen as part of the Jewish people, but had been separated already, and so it was a frightening time for Christians as well. And so Matthew had sat down to try to but to expand on what Mark had already written. You will notice that a lot of the material that Mark had written also shows up in Matthew. And then, of course, a little bit later, around 75, Luke also tries to write down again the stories, and this time with a different message, a different character. And that is that this gospel is going to go into all of the world, and it is really the fulfillment of God's promise to Israel and to the rest of the world, and that's why he continues with the book of Acts. You will notice that 76% of all the stories in Mark also show up in Matthew. The 45% of the Gospel of Matthew comes from Mark, and 41% of the Gospel of Luke comes from Mark. You also notice that 18% of Mark shows up only in Matthew and makes up 10% there. And the Gospel of Luke has 3% of Mark in it, which makes 1% in Luke. Only 3% of Mark is unique, that only Mark has. And then there's an interesting thing, that there are 23% of Luke that also show up in Matthew 25%. These stories show up in both of those Gospels, but not in the Gospel of Mark. And then there are 20% that are unique to Matthew and 35% that are unique in Luke. And so people were wondering how all these Gospels relate to each other, and why there is actually extra material that's only in Matthew and Luke, but those are the same things, and where does that come from if it doesn't come from Mark? In 1832, a German biblical scholar by the name of Friedrich Schleiermacher formulated a hypothesis saying that those extra materials that are in Matthew and Luke only, that they come from another oral source. He calls that the Q, the German word Quelle, meaning source. It is a hypothesis only, but it seems like that there was an oral tradition that of sayings of Jesus that were also floating around, and Matthew and Luke make use of that source, even though Mark did not know about it or didn't use it, but certainly didn't incorporate it into his gospel. So that's the story of the two source hypothesis, that the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke all share material from the Gospel of Mark. Each one of them have extra material. There is Matthew only material, and there is Luke only material. And then there is the source Q of a shared source that Matthew and Luke are using, but that do not show up in Mark. That's the background to the Gospels, and in our next lesson we will delve first into the Gospel of Mark.